Hello learners and welcome to the ninth lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In the previous lecture, I had introduced the idea of the elegy, and I mentioned why the elegy became a very important genre of poetry in the 20th century. In addition to the formal innovation that poets were undertaking, and in addition to the creative impulses of individual poets, there were some sociological developments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries which made this genre very important and which gave many poets an opportunity to write about death and several of the attending circumstances that are related to death. These sociological and cultural developments include the rise of things like the funeral conductor or the funeral director, and an attitude which became more and more important, that the materiality or the finality of death was disappearing. So on one hand, the rituals and the practices surrounding death were becoming more and more elaborate, more and more expensive, visible, tangible. So people were spending money and giving visible form and shape to their remembrance of those who had died. But on the other hand, people were actually spending less and less time simply reflecting or remembering the person who had passed away in that way. This was addressed by several poets, this development, the rise of the material rituals, as well as the decline of a perception of death, was addressed by several poets, and I gave an example of that in the poem Tract by William Carlos Williams. In this lecture, we will read another poem which is a similar illustration of a changing perception of death in the poet's society, and the poet's attempt to address that gap, or the poet's attempt to say that because this change is occurring in my society, I'm going to write about death in a particular way. I'm going to spend some time on this poem because the poem and the poet occupy a very important place in the canon of 20th century poetry. The poem is titled The Emperor of Ice Cream, and the poet is Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens was an insurance agent, a very, very matter-of-fact, financial, very middle-class and very stable profession. And like many other 20th century poets, T.S. Eliot worked in a bank. So in that sense, Wallace Stevens is very typical of the canon of 20th century poets. But Wallace Stevens is also important because he occupies one of the most respected and influential places in the canon of 20th century American poetry as well as 20th century English poetry. Wallace Stevens is widely considered as among the most well-known poets from America in the 20th century, second only to Robert Frost, and a very close second, if that. So Wallace Stevens is important. No survey of 20th century poetry can really afford to do without Stevens. So we will encounter Stevens through this very particular poem. It's a short poem, but it's very compressed and very dense poem, and it does a lot of work. We will try and understand that work in this lecture today. Here is how the poem goes, and I will read the poem first, very briefly, and then I will go over some of the key words, phrases, and their meanings a little bit later. So this is The Emperor of Ice Cream by Wallace Stevens. Call the roller of big cigars, the muscular one, and bid him whip in kitchen cups concupiscent curds. Let the wenches dawdle in such dress as they are used to wear, and let the boys bring flowers in last month's newspapers. Let B be finale of seam. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Take from the dresser of deal, lacking the 3 glass knobs, that sheet on which she embroidered fantails once, and spread it so as to cover her face. If her horny feet protrude, they come to show how cold she is and dumb. Let the lamp affix its beam. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. There are many things that are going on in this poem, and I'll briefly unpack the basic events that occur, the way the poet decides to plot those events, and finally the words the poet chooses to unpack these events in this way, and what is the significance of those words, and finally how the poem comes together to teach us so many new things about death and life. Now, it's important to begin a little bit with the idea of ice cream. This was the early 20th century, and ice cream was not something that could be taken for granted the way it is today. To get a sense of the particular place that ice cream occupied in the society of that time, it may be useful to read from a very important American text, that is Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. In this text, a Sunday school picnic drives the young heroine wild with anticipation. She writes and speaks, and the novel describes these thoughts in this way. It wouldn't matter if I got to 100 picnics in after years. They wouldn't make up for missing this one. They're going to have boats on the lake of shining waters and ice cream, as I told you. I have never tasted ice cream. Diana tried to explain what it was like, but I guess ice cream is one of those things that are beyond imagination. Now, these words give us a sense of how rare and extremely hard to get ice cream was at one time in this century. It is not the case today, but the time in which this poem was written, ice cream was rare. It was rare enough that some people could only dream of it, but it was not so rare that it would be impossible for everyone. Anne's joy, the thoughts that were described in the sentence which I just read, transports readers back to a time before modern contemporary brands like Haagen-Dazs or Baskin-Robbins. This is a world in which household refrigeration was rudimentary. So because we could not take for granted freezers in every household, ice cream had to be mass-produced and could only be disseminated in particular locations. We still have ice cream bars, but back in the day, ice cream could only be found in particular stores. It had to be mass-produced on a modern scale. Ice cream was not beyond imagination. It was available in stores, but it was still an indulgence. It was not a fixture of the average kitchen. And even today in India, there are many people who can remember a time from their childhood when refrigeration could not be taken for granted, and people would wait in the evenings for some kind of a vendor, whether it was an ice cream truck, the way one sees in much American popular culture, or whether it is the local ice cream vendor on a little cycle with a bell carrying ice lollies and other kinds of iced candies, if not ice cream made out of milk. So the early 20th century was a time when ice cream had to be prepared, and it was somewhat of a rare luxury. Stevens composed the ice cream poem, that is the Emperor of Ice Cream, less than 15 years after these words were written. So it is around the year 1923 that Stevens composed the Emperor of Ice Cream. Now, going over some of the words that are used in the first stanza. The first stanza brings together a lot of ideas and images of food, fertility, and even a form of sexuality. The word concupiscent, for instance, can be glossed as either lustful or desirous. And if one really goes back and looks at some of the adjectives, right, the person who makes ice cream is supposed to be a muscular one, right? He is someone who rolls big cigars, and this strength is useful in whipping curds or whipping cream or doing some of the physical work that's required to prepare ice cream. The curds, cream, the dairy-based product, is described as concupiscent. That is, it is rich and signifies something lustful or sexual. And while this is happening in the kitchen, there is something else, that some kind of a flirtatious activity. There are wenches who dawdle in such dress as they are used to wear. And then there are boys bringing in flowers in last month's newspapers. So it seems that there is some kind of a romantic activity going on. It's not clear what exactly it is. It is merely suggested. Wenches can mean both innocent, but also it can refer either to female servants, or it can also refer to prostitutes in different contexts. The word dawdle around the ice cream maker signifies some sort of an suggestive romantic activity. The boys who bring flowers also evoke romance, and the dated newspapers remind readers of the swift passage of time. So this is what we learn in the first stanza, barring the last two lines. The last two lines go thus. Let B be finale of seam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Now, before I gloss these two sentences and the extremely cryptic first line of this couplet, that is, let B be finale of seam, I will quote from Helen Wendler, who's very kindly for us unpacked the plot of the poem and helps us appreciate what Stevens does with this very basic plot. In Wendler's words, which I quote now, the basic story of the emperor is that of a person who goes to the house of a neighbor, a poor old woman who has died. The person is to help lay out the corpse in the bedroom, while other neighbors are sending over homegrown flowers, and yet others are preparing food, including ice cream, for the wake. Right? So this is a basic summary of what happens. Now, how Stevens decides to present this summary. Stevens plots this story into two equal stanzas, one for the kitchen where the ice cream is being made, one for the bedroom where the corpse awaits decent covering. Stevens plots it further by structuring the poem as a series of commands from an unknown master of ceremonies, directing, in a diction of extreme oddness, the neighbors in their funeral duties. Okay? So this is a very compressed narrative, and at this point we can go over the second stanza very briefly. Take from the dresser of deal, lacking the 3 glass knobs, that sheet on which she embroidered fantails once, and spread it so as to cover her face. If her horny feet protrude, they come to show how cold she is and dumb. Let the lamp affix its beam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. So the stanza helps us figure out what is happening in the rest or the other part of the house. So in one part of the house, ice cream is being made, and while that is being made, we get a sense that maybe some sort of flirtation is also taking place. While ice cream and flirtation takes place in one part of the house, in the other part of the same house, something else is taking place. What is that? We get a sense that there is a woman and her feet are horny, which means that they're calloused. This signifies a lack of care, probably an inability to care. Also might signify age or neglect, that maybe she did not have people who could care for her or who could do this work for her, that is, filing and pedicuring her feet. There's also an indication of the economic and social status of this person. The condition of disrepair of the deal, that is, a cheap pine dresser with its missing knobs. So there's a dresser which is missing knobs. Only someone from a particular class, that is lower middle to lower class, would sustain or keep using and not replace a dresser whose 3 knobs have come loose. We get a sense then that the flowers that are being sent are not romantic but funereal. We also get a sense that what is happening in the first stanza, the deserts, the flowers, the celebration, or the bustle and hustle and activity. These activities are designed to prepare for a wake, that is, a communal meal in which a lot of people come together to remember someone who has just passed away. This celebration, and particularly the necessity of having dessert, something sweet, at a wake when someone has died, uh, is part of a Caribbean culture, including many parts of Cuba, where Stevens spent many years traveling, spending time, knowing the people and the place. And this explains the cigar maker who is referred to in the very first line. So there is a contrast then between these two activities. On one hand, there's a great deal of bustling activity, that is flirtation, tasty treats, etc. On the other hand, there is a great deal of morbidity. There is death, there is the inconvenience of having to deal with the body of someone who has just died. And yet, the focus of the poem seems to be on ice cream. It seems to be that ice cream is a symbol that helps connect both of these divergent, contradictory experiences. On one hand, preparing for a communal meal, preparing desserts, vigorously whipping together milk and cream, the energetic act of preparing dessert, the hopeful act of preparing something sweet, the hopeful act of romance, flirtation. This is one set of experiences, one cluster of moods, one can even say. On the other hand, there is a contradictory set of experiences regarding death, the lack of hope, the lack of energy, the lack of any positive feeling. And somehow, both these two things, energy and its lack, hope and its lack, fertility and its end, hope and despair, all of these things come together in the image of ice cream, and particularly in the line, the Emperor of Ice Cream. Now we can come to that line, let B be end of seam. There are multiple ways in which scholars have tried to gloss that line, and I'll go over some of them. One way in which we can understand what the poet is trying to say, or the poet is trying to say to readers who have witnessed, on one hand, the preparation of ice cream and are about to witness the dead body in the next room. These readers are being told by the poet that they should be realistic and they should reject idealism. That is, let B be end of seam. Let B, that is, do not pretend anymore, do not remain idealistic, do not be fooled by the possibility of preparing desserts. Do not be fooled by the fact that you can have milk and you can buy sugar and you can put all of these things together to produce an extremely delightful and pleasurable experience of having ice cream. That experience should not fool you into neglecting the facts. What are the facts? The facts are that as sure as the fact that we are born, we are all going to die. So we are born to die. This is a fact that no amount of sweetness, or no matter how good and rich and creamy the ice cream may be, should take us away from that fact. The word finale in this sentence also refers to death, meaning only in death does the seeming or pretending end. Seeming can be glossed as an effort to appear to be something different from what one in fact is. And B is the opposite of seem. B is being truthful to oneself, not trying to appear to be different, but simply owning and embracing the most fundamental truth of one's existence. So finale, that is death, ends all acts of pretension. So we should remember that because we are going to die, we should not pretend. We should not try to appear to be something we are not. And because if we keep pretending, we will lose the opportunity to really live. So this is one way in which the line, let B be finale of seem, can be glossed. But then what about the line that follows? That is, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. The emperor of ice cream is a somewhat odd expression because ice cream is a word that produces a connotation of different sort of values. These are values of benignity, sweetness, possibility, pleasure. Whereas emperor connotes a different set of values. It connotes absolute imperial power. And the poet seems to bring these two things together in order to convey something essential about human life, which the poet has learned by witnessing these two things, by witnessing the preparation of ice cream in one room while a corpse lies waiting to be covered in the other room. Uh, the meanings multiply of this expression, the emperor of ice cream. Ice cream is a sensuous delight. It is eagerly anticipated and gleefully consumed. That is, it is really good. Not only does it taste good, but there's something about ice cream which means that it has to be consumed very quickly. It does not allow for too much reflection or rumination. If one ruminates or reflects on ice cream, then it will melt and the enjoyment of those sensuous pleasures will be denied. Right? So, ice cream is an ephemeral pleasure, like life, like fertility, like sexual activity, like flowers, like the daily newspaper, and like life itself. So, this is one message or one set of images, one cluster of moods that the phrase the emperor of ice cream is trying to convey. That life is short, ephemeral, and the sensuous delights of life can be had only by really living life, not by ruminating or reflecting too much on what life is. This is one set of values and ideas that the poet is trying to convey. There are other ideas as well. The coldness connects both ice cream and death. Right? Ice cream is cold, but in a way that's very different from the way death is cold. Cold appears in this poem only as a description of the woman's body. Right? Both the woman's body, that is, the woman who has died, and the ice cream that's being prepared are cold, and how radically different these two objects are. The poem links these two coldnesses. Right? The poem links the chill of death with a frozen dessert, and Stevens implies that death and the sensuous pleasures of life have something in common. Right? The sensuous pleasures of life, that is, everything that we enjoy, everything that gives us pleasure in life, and the fact that we are going to die, these two things have something in common. What is that? A sense of detachment or isolation. The dead woman is insensible to cold, towards the lively goings on in the kitchen, and those dawdling girls don't seem very concerned with her either. Right? So, both the pleasure and the denial of pleasure, or the lack of existence, the end of life, both of these things happen in isolation. And this is something that the poet is observing about the contemporary society. That is, society has reached a point where, through a material pursuit of comfort or commodities or capitalism, we have forgotten that on one hand the pleasures might be real, but equally real is the fact that we will soon die. So, this is something that the poet would like to change. And this is one project or ambition this poem has, to connect these two things which appear to be disconnected. Emperor also connotes absolute power, particularly the way death holds power over life. Now, the scholar Eleanor Cook has a very important gloss on the line, "The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream." And Cook points to several connections between this poem and William Shakespeare's play Hamlet. The word seem, let be finale of seem, the word seem also comes from a very important line in Hamlet, particularly when Hamlet tells Gertrude that his grief for his father is not something that he is pretending or showing to feel, but he feels something which words or expressions really fail to convey. And the line from Hamlet, if I can remember correctly, is, "I know not seems, I have that within which passeth show." right? I think it begins with "Seems, madam, I know not seems," and then it ends with the words, "I have that within which passeth show." So the seeming is related to death. In Hamlet, death produces the end of seeming or pretension, and the same implication, the same desire for the end of seeming is expressed in Wallace Stevens as well. In the Stevens poem, readers are reminded that all pretension, all celebration, all activity, all rituals become realistic and minimalistic when we remember the fact that death will end everything and none of this will stay once we die. However, the scholar Eleanor Cook points out another very strong parallel, textual parallel between Hamlet and this poem. Hamlet not only makes many famous remarks, but he also uses the metaphor of emperor to make a very important point about death. Uh, in Act 4, when other characters are looking for a dead body, Hamlet says to Claudius, "Your worm is your only emperor for diet. We fat all creatures else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots." Again, this shows the psychological state that Hamlet is in, that he is so consumed with the futility and the pointlessness of this existence that he calls the worm an emperor. And the imagination goes that when human bodies decompose, they are consumed by worms. And so it seems futile to eat, to eat rich or fatty or creamy or sweet food, because ultimately the bodies that we are fattening or the desires or the cravings that we are satiating or that we are indulging with good food, ultimately it will go to naught. It will come to naught because our bodies will be consumed by worms. And this point that human beings aren't at the top of the food chain, that worms in our graves are actually above us in the food chain because when we die, we are consumed and decomposed by worms, resonates with the themes of this poem. This poem has a somewhat morbid outlook on life. The lives of all creatures are fragile and temporary, and all creatures obey a sovereign impulse towards hedonism. Therefore, the point seems to be because lives are short and fragile, one must naturally feast as much as one can while the opportunity is there. So, because we're all going to end up like the poor old woman with calloused feet, one may as well eat as much ice cream as one possible. That is one way in which one can gloss the line, "The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream." In the words of the scholar Helen Wendler, there is an important gloss to these lines as well. The only god of this world is the cold god of persistent life and appetite. And I must look steadily at this repellent but true tableau: the animal life in the kitchen, the corpse in the back bedroom. Ice cream is like life, sweet, or at least hungrily indulged in while it lasts. It's also like the dead, it's cold and destined to be consumed or to dissipate away. Perhaps then, the line that closes each stanza is a wake-up call to readers, right? That the death comes for all. And in the way that we imagine death, we need to become a little more realistic. Not simply to ignore death and to blindly celebrate life, but to celebrate life and embrace death, both with a very realistic awareness of the undeniability of both. I'll end by referring to a couple of important biographical contexts to this poem. I mentioned that Wallace Stevens was a reserved insurance lawyer. He was based in Hartford, Connecticut, and personally was known to have a great love for food. Not just food, but especially sweets and desserts. Several relatives, friends, respondents who were interviewed by Stevens' biographers confessed that they remember Wallace Stevens, the person, having a great love for good food and especially sweet desserts. While this was true, as a poet, And as a writer, Stevens displayed a very competitive and contradictory streak, which was a streak of asceticism. Now, the streak of asceticism, which meant that as a poet he had to make many sacrifices, deny himself many pleasures, in order to be successful as a writer and a poet. Between these two contradictory impulses, we can situate this poem. Its two stanzas map onto these contradictions. One is a celebration and anticipation of ice cream. The other is describing how the corpse of a dead woman needs to be covered and prepared for the funeral. Between its two stanzas and its two rooms, the poem is neatly divided between a depiction of bustling life and a contemplation of lonely death. It turns a vibrant locale into a reminder of our ultimate destination, a once exotic seeming desert into a symbol of what fate serves up to all of us in the end. So this was Wallace Stevens' The Emperor of Ice Cream. It helps us appreciate the compression, symbolism, the powerful images that 20th century poets used. And it also situates the elegy as a very important genre in the 20th century. We will continue our discussion of 20th century poetry and go to another very important poet, Thomas Hardy, in the next lecture. Thank you.